many of us can imagine a nice future. Very few people can figure out how to break something down into a journey that gets you there in small steps.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining the conversation today. We're kicking off 2024. And I'm lucky enough to have Larry Fitzpatrick, CTO of OneMain Financial, joining me today in a conversation where, last year I was talking to folks really around the idea of what does it mean to be a chief digital officer and to formalize corporate innovation efforts. What does that really mean on the ground in the business? I think as we were coming out of last year, Larry, um, AI came over the horizon faster than most people are essentially prepared for. And so I thought it would be interesting today, in addition to this kind of normal conversation I have, to really try to look at AI initiatives within the broader construct of corporate innovation and what it means to be running a technology organization. So, with that said, I'd love to hand it over to you, maybe to introduce yourself and OneMain Financial and a little bit about your journey there, and then we can jump right in.
Sure. Thanks, Pat. Great to be here. Just a little bit about my background. I've done what I call sometimes the grand slam of technology. I've spent a good portion of my career in applied R&D. I've worked in the software product industry. I ran a services company for a while that we sold, and then I did the transition. So that was about 7 years. And I've also been in-house in IT twice for long stints. I came to OneMain 4 years ago as the head of digital. 18 months in, I ascended to the CTO position. OneMain is a subprime lender, the largest independent subprime lender in the country. And the journey that we're on started in 2018, where private equity bought a majority of the company, installed new leadership team, new CEO, who then hired new people at the top. And the idea was, let's move from a branch based, in person, single product company to a multi product, omni-channel company. And so we're well into that journey. And of course, there's a lot of heavy lifting that's gone on to date, and still a lot to go forward. But that's kind of where we're at.
Well, I appreciate that overview. And, in terms of having an executive mandate or a corporate mandate for that kind of transformation, I guess that kind of, um, new kind of private equity perspective is a pretty strong banner, right, to lead that kind of transformation. And you came in as chief digital officer initially. So, this is a title that can mean many different things at different scales of org in regulated, unregulated industries. It might be just beneficial for you to kind of talk about that role and expectation. And then now, as you've transitioned, how do you see the differences between your role now and where you came in with the chief digital officer role?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. So, head of digital here was really created to drive the adoption of more of an omni-channel experience, exploit voice, exploit web presence, exploit mobile, and try and shift some of the workload and some of the customer experience away from having to come into the branch. I started in February of 2020, and in literally 4 weeks later to the day, the shutdown happened. I was visiting one
Hmm.
of our teams, our digital team in Chicago, and I was going to stay the weekend for St. Patty's Day. I've never seen the river. The river dyed green there before. Pat and I know, both Irish background.
Yeah.
That'd be a nice thing to do. But literally, the world shut down. And, in a way, that was really good for the digital agenda because our employees started getting sick. They didn't want to come into the office. Our customers didn't want to come into the office. So we had to very rapidly deploy a lot of capabilities that allowed our customers to interact more with us digitally. Um, you know, the the downside to that is that we essentially paved over the branch sales motion, right? The in-person sales motion. And it was incredibly successful because we went in the space of 1 year from less than 1% of our customers closing a loan remotely to almost 50% closing a loan remotely, right? Which is just massive, right? Now that's with assistance online, with some digital tools around it. but it was a huge change for us. I was about 18 months in when I got tapped to be the CTO because the prior CTO had left. And in a way, that was really perfect because um, the the reality of applying a multi-product digital veneer to a legacy branch-based operating environment started to crash in on us. There are things that we wanted to do from a test and learn perspective that we were just incapable of doing because a lot of the um, process motion, it was really designed to support, a multi-thousand person sales force in the field where you were in person with the customer and guiding them through a process, and was very, it worked great in a branch-based business model, but it didn't scale to the need to do test and learn, move certain pieces around of the flow, maybe not do parts of the flow if you learn something about the customer. So we really ran into one tech stack limitations. The second thing we ran into is the systems were largely built to support branch-based hours, right? Which was 5.5 days a week. Um, you know, we did monthly deployments. Those deployments lasted many hours on a Sunday because nobody was coming into the branch, but our digital channels were down. Like people couldn't apply. Um, we couldn't send out communications and so forth. And then the third one really gets to the skilling, right? We needed to sort of bring in sort of a different skill set to augment the skill set that was in place that had sophistication around digital communications, user interface design, um, you know, um, workflow optimization and stuff like that. So that 18 months in, the transition to being CTO allowed me to make a lot more changes to the underlying infrastructure of the company, we call the enablers to becoming more digital, because we had exhausted what we were able to do by just bolting stuff onto existing ways of doing things.
Yeah, and I've seen like in a lot of organizations the size of OMF, you can run the risk potentially of having the kind of innovation island of misfit toys that isn't fully integrated into core ways of doing things. In terms of your, opinion or approach on how you position that, kind of motion within some new organizational structures, like where do you sit on that, and what was your experience kind of, or maybe it's still a set of open questions and things you and team are working on.
No, that's a great question, and it turns out it was one of the first things that we tackled. The operating model of technology prior was what you would expect from an in-house IT shop supporting technology for our employees, not technology for our customers. And so there were a lot of requests that came in. There was limited prioritization mechanisms around that. And one of the things we put in place in late 2020, and then we've gotten stronger about it every year, is an objectives and key results mechanism. So we reorganized our tech teams to align to value streams that segment to pieces of the customer journey, and then we set up OKRs around that. And the top 5 EVPs in the company meet every year, and then monthly to review, and then quarterly when we do replanning to update what our objectives and key results are. And that really did a couple of things for us. One is it got super clarity about what we should be working on, right? As opposed to, hey, a ticket came in, so and so who seems like a smart person somewhere in an operation said, let's do this. And it gets prioritized because, well, that's easy to do. Let's do that. We can push that out in the next release. No. We want to be very driven by priorities, working backwards from the strategic mandate of the company. And I should say that a lot of work had gone into laying a business strategy in place. So we weren't like unaware of where we were trying to go as a business. We've introduced a credit card. We've launched and expanded an auto lending business, grown our wellness capabilities around customer experience. So we had a clear mandate from a business perspective was how do we actually get the engineering organization or the development and delivery organization focused on that. So the OKRs worked really well for that. It also allowed us to, as you know, like what we want to get to is lots of small autonomous teams that move like at high speed. It allowed us to break essentially a monolithic sort of like delivery mechanism of close to 1,000 people into much smaller teams where they could move more nimbly and break apart some of the dependencies. Now there was a lot of pain early on because the tech stack didn't support this breakage, and so while we would I spent a lot of time selling snake oil by saying that we want autonomous independent teams, don't talk to me about dependencies, when in reality there were technical dependencies underneath. But it was the impetus, working it in from the outside was the pressure we needed to force the breakage of those dependencies that didn't really need to exist, right? So I think the prioritization process we put in place is working really well. We've got buy-in at the executive level, and it really is permeated and created this notion of not it's like technology is the business too. We have people who say, well, I got to go talk to the business. That was 3 years ago. Now it's like I got to go talk to marketing. I got to talk to credit. I got to go talk to operations, right? And technology is becoming recognized as the business too, not just technology.
Yeah, I feel like, this recentering of technology to earnings per share or to market or the business economic drivers is one of the kind of outcomes for this multi-year journey of recentering. What does it mean to digitally transform a business? And it is the more that there are clear alignments to the business case that the technology teams can feel some pride of ownership in moving the needle on, is one of the cultural elements that gets there. I think to your other point, um, you know, we were focusing a lot last year in conversations with folks around the idea of developer productivity, right, as like
Yeah.
a measurable thing. And one of the hardest thing in regulated industries, you have high integrity systems, you have the mainframes sitting at the core of this stuff. Just moving that tech stack isn't always the easiest thing. And I think it's one of the things, if maybe we kind of shift gears a little bit and say, well, one of the holy grails or silver bullet potential of AI is that all that COBOL code, right, and getting that modernized. I mean, uh, in your industry, there's a lot of that. How does,
Yes.
maybe just thoughts on that monolith moving and how that's like high integrity code, millions of lines of code, and now all of a sudden the silver bullets coming over the horizon. Typically, it's a lot of lead bullets. Where are you guys kind of looking at that? And in this very real issue, I'm sure it's on the radar for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, it's a bit of a silver mirage at the moment. But there's a lot of work going on that we're part of around this. So first of all, we didn't take the position that we needed to modernize our legacy technology stack. A lot of our stack and a lot of the code we're written is very stable and supports a very unique business model. We're state regulated. There are no third-party packages we can go insert. We've looked. We did a fairly lengthy exploration to replace some of our core technology. We would essentially be taking the shell of a third party and then re-implementing all of our software all over again, right? And what's the business case for that? There isn't, right? Books and records works just fine. Accounting works just fine, right? Huge parts of supporting our branch environment and our central environment work just fine, right? So our approach has been, where do we, in this objectives and key results, right? As we go through this exercise of what is our credit and analytics organization, who are a bunch of really smart people who do a lot of really interesting machine learning stuff. What do they need? Where are we not satisfying them? What is our operation? We're very sophisticated about hiring, training, and deploying and managing and all the controls around a workforce that's interacting with customers in a regulated industry. What do they need? How can we support them better? And what we came to the conclusion is that there are a handful of pieces of the technology stack where we could actually really move the needle on the business. And then that required, where it interacted with our core systems, it requires more of a refactoring and maybe in some cases a re-implementation. But when we re-implement, it's not because we just want to rewrite this in Java and move it to the cloud. It's because we're going to actually change the way we execute that business, right? So the way we do quote generation or pricing or underwriting or the way we communicate with the customer, radically different than we have in the core world of the past, right? In the past, customer made a payment, core system sent out an email, boom. Now those communications are pulled out. Our marketing and customer success people can contemplate, how do we orchestrate a communication across an email, an SMS, and maybe leading to a phone call or a voice you know, return or a secure email message. So our focus on the modernization piece has really been very, very strategic and targeted. And one of the things we found is that the key driver for us in the digital channels is it's test and learn and cycle time reduction, right? We couldn't do that. It was 3 to 6 months the way we were operating with our core systems before. Run 2 tests a year? Are you kidding me? Right? So we need to be doing like 2 tests a month or 2 tests a week. And in some areas, we've moved the needle very, very far, particularly in pricing, underwriting, and risk controls, where we need to adapt to the market. Where we've got a great business partner, and we've been able to really accelerate the way we do things. Communications has really been evolving very rapidly, and our origination system is something we've just gone down the path of. How do we actually reimagine how that works so that there's a lot more flexibility in the flow, right? Think about the legacy flow, right? It's based on a branch. If you want to change that flow, you've got to retrain 7 to 10,000 people, right? So you don't do it a lot, and you've learned over time how that works. But in a digital channel, you can apply more data. Maybe we don't do information income verification for this person because we already know it. Maybe we, don't do identity verification the same way because we already have some information about that person. It's a renewal and they already have a login. We know who they are, right? To adjust those flows rapidly requires a completely different approach to the technology stack. And so that's kind of the focus that we've been taking on innovation around the business.
Well, that's interesting because I've often found myself in conversation with leaders that are saying, look, I got two budgets. I got my OPEX budget, and that's within the current product roadmap. And then every year we get this CapEx budget, but I can't just port a bunch of COBOL to Java. We got to add something for the business in that CapEx
Yes,
budget. And so
right.
if you're able to, with this strategy, limit additional CapEx budget requests because you can absorb it into the OpEx and it's just part of how these teams are working. I got to imagine the CFO is loving that strategy because now the innovation isn't synonymous with 9-figure 10-figure capital budget requests that were the way that 5 years ago some of these things had to happen, big rewrites, that kind of thing.
Um, yes and no. I think, one of the things we're trying to get to is autonomous teams that are very software product centric, right? So at that point, you've got a stable team. And to the extent that there's demand or things that you can experience, you just want to push it into the team and you don't want rapid, we got to double the team this month. We got to we got to shrink the team. So we want some stability there. That said, we still try and carve out, and there are accounting reasons why we would, right? We want to carve out capital expense and really try and separate. But a lot of that goes to depressing what we call the BAU, the business as usual, and like being really judicious around holding BAU work accountable to a business outcome too. Because a lot of times you've seen organizations, I'm sure, Pat, where, you know, it's a going concern and you're constantly making changes, but you have to worry, like, how do I aggregate up all those changes and say that delivered, um, you know, so many points to the bottom line or not. You can't do that math, right? And so we've been trying to depress a lot of the BAU and move it towards sort of like investment decision. The good news is we have an organization that is highly data centric. Like I said, a credit and analytics organization like measures everything. And so we're able to actually do a pretty good job of trying to quantify the benefit of what we prioritize.
Well, that's really interesting. So maybe we shift some focus here on the AI pieces of it. Now, um, if we were having this conversation last year, it would have been a more data centric conversation. Like, okay, firms are trying to get more competent in software lifecycle, product platform development. They're connecting the pipes, then they get some data aggregation, and then from that, maybe some machine learning. And it seems like a lot of the conversations are starting at the top of the mountain about AI plus everything. And so I'm just curious in terms of, maybe you could talk a little bit about your guys' kind of journey into getting this. Where does it sit now? Where do you see it relative to some of that other foundational work? And has it changed anything when you talk about the way you want your product teams experimenting? Is this kind of new and different and special, and you're factoring it in as like a new thing, or is it fitting more in line with, any of the other, kind of maturity points that you feel like your teams are just naturally adopting already? Can you just kind of speak a little bit about how AI is factoring in?
Sure. About a year ago, we formed a working group, a small working group of senior leaders. I co-chair it with our head of data science, and there's a couple of people that are core in the inner core ring. And the initial sort of like work streams were, okay, this is a game changer. Do we need to change any of our policies and procedures or practices in order to absorb it? And we did do a few things. We updated our acceptable use policy to basically say, hey, if you use any of this stuff, you're still accountable for the outcome. Like, just you can't use, well, GPT told me, like, that's not an excuse, right? And so the second thing we looked at was our third party pipeline. We want to know, like, we figure a huge amount of our adoption is ultimately going to be what we get from third parties. So we have to be able to be good evaluators of that and actually know what risks we're shipping on board. Because one thing that's clear from the emerging regulation is the risk profile that the vendor is providing is not the same risk profile that you're adopting as a user of what they, right? So you can't go back and say, well, they did it. No, 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 you absorbed it, you used it. So we just got to get good about that. Then we started seeding lots of things, and the easy ones are, giving access to the office productivity co-pilots, code co-pilots, and then we started, sort of like examining particular use cases. And what really, really boils down is we know, like, data analysis is a huge win here, right? Anywhere where we are doing lots of document processing, summarizing documents, looking for salient pieces of documents, pulling features out of text documents or otherwise for, to feed a data pipeline of some kind or another, machine learning. All of that stuff is way better with Gen AI. Obviously, anybody in the content creation business, our marketing team were early adopters. We have this really cool success story. We did an investor day in December, and there were a few video recordings. It's on the website. There were a few video recordings in that. And after the recordings were done, high production, in the can, in a review, somebody said, those three words are wrong. We got to change that. Right. So rather than recut that, you just record a few minutes of the speaker, right? Send it to 11 labs, right? Give it the words you want, get the snippet back, paste it back in. Like, in a couple of hours, that was fixed, as opposed to, oh, we got to recreate that and recut the scene and put it in, right? So there's lots of use cases like that. A couple of use cases where we're pushing on very hard are in the code refactoring space. So, like you said, we have a lot of legacy code, COBOL, et cetera, other code, Ruby on Rails. And the COBOL one is particularly challenging, where we're not going to get rid of it, but we actually need to take business functionality, separate the user experience from the business logic, from the data layer, and refactor it so that we can put it behind an API and use it as part of our transformation. And we're working with several people now doing POCs. Can we accelerate that process with Gen AI based programming language understanding tools that can answer questions like, explain what this code does, right? And like, some of this code is like really old. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if the people who wrote it are no longer with us. Maybe the people who modified it for the first or second generation are no longer with us, right? So nobody really knows what it does. It reminds me of the XP movement, right? If you remember XP Explained, the big mantra was, extreme programming was like, um, was don't fear change, right? So I think these tools are giving us and will give us ever increasing confidence around being able to make change to significant parts of legacy systems. Not only explain it, refactor it, generate test cases for it, compare new to old, and move on. That's a big use case. And then there are a bunch of sort of like vision type things down the road. We hire a lot of people. The training cycle is rigorous and long. Can we expedite the training cycle? And then, of course, there's, the support situation, right? How do we actually support our customers using tools more than humans? But I think there's a few hurdles we have to cross for that.
Yeah, and I think what's also interesting when you think about other industries, like you got to you got to pass the Series 7 to be a stockbroker. You got to get a medical license to do surgeries, and people talk about real ethics as it relates to ethical uses of AI. I don't know. I mean, not off the top of my head, as it relates to kind of banking and finance, but are there Is it the need for in the things you guys doing? Have there been concerns or questions around what's kind of ethical, or is it something that is a maturing conversation, or is it not over the radar yet for you guys?
Yeah, no, it's very high on the radar for the following reason. I think um, it's really important to understand that generative AI is fundamentally different than other technologies in the sense that we can't explain how it's working, and it's non reproducible in many cases. And so we know that it starts to exhibit a lot of the behaviors that sometimes we might label as bad behaviors in humans. There was a great paper that came out, a tech report that came out in December, where this research organization trained a stock trading bot, and they in their training of that stock trading GPT, they informed it that like insider trading was really bad. Like you can't do it; it'll take the company down. And then they gave it a bunch of data and asked for it to develop training strategies. It turns out it exploited the insider information, and then when interrogated about it, denied that it did. Right? Okay, so then you go, okay, so it's non-deterministic. We don't really know what it's doing and how it's working. Where do we feel safe? I don't know anybody in financial services who is actually deploying generative AI to customers directly, right? There's definitely human in the loop is the watchword, but I still think there's more that we have to do, right? It's around how do we understand and quantify the risk profile of a new solution that uses generative AI. As a business, we're 115 years old. We've developed a lot of intuitions about how to control a workforce that's, you know, how to educate them, how to make sure that they're doing the right thing by the customer, they're doing the right thing by regulation, right? We've got all sorts of guardrails around that. Like, how do we get the confidence to replace some of the human there with a machine? We don't have a solve for that yet.
Yeah.
And I think that's an industry problem. It's not just us.
Yeah, and I'm sure that will be an evolving conversation for the next foreseeable future as well, because people have to throw some of these things at the wall. We need to see some of this stuff more in production to figure out where more of the blind spots actually are. So, did you guys then, and just trying to get back to maybe some of the structural decision making stuff that people think about?
Mm-hmm.
When I think about it in terms of Modus, I think about us, essentially doing a SWOT analysis internally, end to end on the company. Where are the opportunity spaces to deploy things quickly and learn? Where are things that could transform fundamentally how we deliver our value proposition? You mentioned OKRs as a framework. It's, to me, that's one of the most simply deceiving frameworks out there because it seems so simple when you explain it. To get
It's
it
not.
working at scale is very difficult.
Yeah.
Was there anything helpful to you in terms of trying to lay out the master plan, of understanding opportunity domains for AI? Did you find anything comparable to OKRs or any other prioritization framework that you felt like, you know, or is this something that was, that you think still needs some work?
Yeah. So our first round was really, um, trying to um, aggregate the best thinking of people across the company about where this might be valuable and where we might want to put some focus. I think in the next wave, what we're planning is taking a look at everything we do, right, from an investment perspective, where we're pushing technology, and asking the question, like, is there a generative AI angle to this, right? And then, if the answer is there could be, then trying to assess, all right, on a trade-off perspective, should we just power forward because it's not mature enough with what we would normally do in the past, or should we delay and wait for something to mature, or should we go ahead and try and figure out how we embrace it? And so, trying to roll that out through 2024 is part of something that we look at across the portfolio, and it's not just the applications to support our business; it's our infrastructure too. I mean, as you know, on the infrastructure side, you've got folks helping us. There's lots of machine learning and AI built into, particularly, you know, security tools, operational monitoring, predictive stuff. So there's lots of opportunities to build that in. But generative AI being qualitatively different, we need to be asking the question: is there an opportunity to embed this here for a benefit? And I think that will drive the awareness
Yeah.
and the reasoning. To your point about OKRs, like people confuse objectives and key results all the
all
time,
the time.
right?
Yeah, I wonder. So
And actions, right?
yeah,
OKRAs, right? The action.
but believe me, though, it's I feel like these words, the more you talk about them, the less you can discern what they are, and then you add your yearly goals on top of that, and yeah, the and I would just kind of put it out there too. I know you guys are a fairly distributed organization, but um, it's been amazing to me within the scope of our organization that having a common language for how we discuss things, what strategy means, what go to market means versus a playbook and a strategy and a plan, and creating those terms of art inside the organization that allow the emergent leaders to know what you're talking about when you're talking about, and even just the OKRs. I mean, I think we asked everyone to read the Measure What Matters book as a starting point
Yeah,
for defining our business glossary of this is what it's going to mean when we talk about it. And really underestimated the need for that common shared understanding to just even begin that
right.
discussion. What I was going to ask a follow up on was so being a publicly traded organization is a different kind of a beast altogether. I know from the cyber world, there are even like, I forget what it is, 14K, or there's some kind of SEC disclosure when people have breaches or things they have to do. Is there anything as it relates to AI, or do you think that for publicly traded, or organizations, are there going to be disclosures? Do you think, or are there even additional concerns that you have from a rigor perspective because you're a public organization?
Um, yeah, I think the US is a little bit behind. The UK is really working hard on an AI policy. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday or today. It's basically like, you know, what Europe does good is regulation. They're exporting that to the rest of the world. So, um, there's a woman. I can't remember her name. She's a lawyer. She's written a book called Trust, and basically she cataloged 39 nations and all of the states what they're cooking up in terms of regulation. And what seems very, very clear is there's going to be a pattern there. People are going to want to understand, like, there are something like, I don't remember, it's like 17 use cases where you shall not use AI, and then there's a set of boundary use cases where if you use it you have to actually justify and show and audit and all these other things, and then there's other use cases where it's like, fine, don't worry about it. And so I definitely think that's coming. We already live under a regulatory regime where the things that we do have to be explainable, which almost, like underwriting, pricing decisions, um, you know, for bias and so forth. We just need to. There's a whole bunch of rules. The other area that people don't pay attention to a lot is the employment regime, right? It's like there's a lot of labor law, like internally. When can you use it in terms of evaluating people, or like how do you use it in sort of like performance management of your workforce? There's a whole pocket of activity over there. So I think it's emerging, and I think the posture we're taking is to try and stay in front of it by being aware of where it might land, and not getting into a situation where we have to back stuff out.
That's very interesting. And again, it speaks to kind of beyond the walls just of the tech organization. Like every department is looking at it,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
um, I think there's an informative role within the tech org to play because a lot like when I even just think about just the application of things like OKRs or sprints, these engineering concepts into how your HR team works, right? They're now thinking in terms of sprints and OKRs and things. And so as a general management philosophy, it seems kind of natural that the more technology enables core value and revenue, the more the methodologies for running a tech org permeate into the business operations itself. Although not always as comfortably as I guess engineering background people would say. It's
Would
easy,
like,
right?
right.
Um, okay, so then I guess just before we move on to other things, is there anything that you find kind of unique or interesting that you feel like is worth sharing that your team is doing, or something that you've kind of stumbled into that you thought, wow, we're going to look more deeply at this as it relates to AI versus where you are now versus when you were, say, starting the journey or getting the company kind of ready to take step forward?
Um, you know, First of all, where we are now from where we were a year ago is like in a vastly different place. I mean, everybody was agog. What does this thing do? How can I use it? Now we have a set of sort of like real um, applications where we can start piloting, experimenting, rolling things out into production. Um, the the hype curve, right? The promise is, it always takes a while. There's some elasticity, and it takes a while for things to catch up. But I think this is a don't if you don't play, you don't get it. Where we're looking at now is can we vision type like a future 5 years out where what would pressure test, what would our business look like if AI, generative AI in particular, because we're already heavily machine learning based organization, but generative AI, if it were to continue on the trajectory it's on, we could just sort of forecast that and play some what if games, and then try and work backwards from that in terms of saying, okay, our investments now in Gen AI should be steering us towards that, unless we learn something along the way where we go, that's probably not the direction we want to go in. And so that's kind of the big learning I think that's happened in the last few months is like, all right, the influx, the fire hose of new information is like it's washed over us. We've sipped what we can sip. We can step back and now like, how do we actually plot a course against this? And I really think anchoring in some kind of vision type is going to be incredibly useful.
Well, what I think is very interesting about that, I wrote it down. If you don't play at all, you're not going to be able to get it. It's kind of Ray Kurzweiler-esque in the sense that if every decade is geometrically, we're on an exponential curve
Yeah,
here, then the the hype curve will be so compressed that it'll be like, yeah, there was hype, but that was for 30 minutes 6 months ago. It's prime time now. And
right,
that is such a different way of thinking when 10, 15 years ago, with say the advent of the smartphone, there was plenty of time to do a vanity project, a lot of little experiments, and learning. And here, the tools, while new, are actually leading to innovation and learning, even as they are maturing. And that's a
right.
very different thing to manage than something that you're looking at. Well, we're trying it out now, but 5 years from now, we'll see. It's here.
Yeah.
That's very
The other thing,
fascinating.
one other thing I've sort of learned on this too, though, is that like there's a lot of hype around how much you can do so quickly with generative AI. Look, I can glue together this little application that does this, that, or the other thing. In a commercial business with production setting, that's noise. That's round off error. That doesn't move the needle on the business. The problems we have to solve are really hard problems, right? And so that takes some concerted engineering effort. The death of the programmer, I think, is like prematurely announced. And those constructs around programming, like, understanding what problem you're trying to solve, working incrementally, working in close partnership with your business partners, right, to get that done. Those things aren't going to change anytime soon. Um,
Yeah, and
we've got to
I
go
tell
and
you,
consume.
I find myself talking to younger engineers, and I say, look, I've been at this like 25 years now, which I can't imagine. But I'm like, every 5 years, I was told I would be out of a job in 5 years. I mean, that was just when development environments came out. People said, oh, we're not going to need you because business analysts will be dragging and dropping and low code,
Exactly.
and
The
so
case tools of the 80, the low code of the aughts. Yeah.
yeah, all of that. And I think, again, the framing that I try to think about it is we get a productivity flywheel. And what
Yes.
small teams can do, and be cross-functional and work across the whole stack as opposed to needing specialists at every point. These are tools that are allowing versatilists to, everyone to essentially be a versatilist. And even in the even when I think about the more creative pursuits in the business, the marketing folks and others, even the business development folks, there's just a multiplier effect of, write us a proposal in the style of the last 30 proposals that we won. And I
Yeah.
think as folks just open their mind to your point, to diving in on that, this isn't replacing me. This is allowing, how much more leverage can we get on our
Yeah.
workforce? But that's those stories are the hard ones to sell to TechCrunch and others. I think gloom and doom, and everyone's out of a job maybe sells a little bit more. Okay, but there's some
Maybe.
clear themes here, Larry. So if I think about, there are a lot of folks who are not as far into the journey as that you're in. There's a lot of folks that are just getting even the chief digital officers, the first time role within some of these organizations, and you've had the benefit of kind of walking through some of these things as these industries have been evolving. What are your thoughts to folks that are starting their journey, and not just kind of the transformation or the kind of AI journey, but they're in one of these newer roles, and they're obviously going to be asked about what their AI strategy is. What are some of the learnings or advice? How would you frame it to someone in their first 90 days, or what you think that year one should look like for folks?
In terms of adopting AI, Gen
Or
AI,
just if you
or
were,
just in
if
general?
I'm coming to you saying, "Hey, Larry, I've known you for a long time. I just got this role, and it's either going to be the best job or the worst job I've ever had, but I won't know for 6 months. How should I run my first 2 quarters?" What do you think is like? Just do you have any good framing or thoughts on that you would share with someone on how to get started in being the
Yeah,
change leader role for this kind of work?
yeah. I mean, I think sort of some of the truths don't really ever change. The invariance, which is you've really got to understand the business itself and what moves the needle on the business and what the constraints are of the business and work backwards from that. A lot of young tech folks, including myself, got hyped, about technology, but really coding something up is 10% of the problem. You've really got to figure out how that's going to get buy-in from your partners, what impact it's going to make to that business. And then there's sort of like the rollout and deployment aspect. Now, if you're a tech software company, that's a different problem. But if tech is part of your business and your business is doing something else, like you've got to worry about how you're moving the whole business forward. And that takes time. And so the hardest part, I think, for people to reason through is, okay, I can imagine what a possible future might look like. I understand what like the business problems are. I've solved that problem. Okay, now I've cleared two hurdles. My third hurdle is like, how do I actually roadmap that where like I can increment my way to success? How do I find the first milestone that's going to be a valuable proof point? I think that skill I find to be exceptionally rare in technologists is we can many of us can imagine a nice future. Some of us can't. We follow other people. That's fine. Um, Very few people can figure out how to break something down into a journey that gets you there in small steps. And that's true at that's a fractal property of technology, right? You know this. Agile teams like work breakdown. Can I get this done in a 2 week sprint? Like if you're moving from 3 month waterfall to a 2 week sprint, like that challenge of how do I break that thing down into something small is the hardest hurdle to get over, right? It is a skill you can develop though. And so I think really focusing on that aspect, working backwards and then road mapping is really the key. And then we both worked for somebody who used to say all the time, under promise and over deliver.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's some of the best advice is the stuff that's always true, right? For all the things that change, right? This idea that we're here to manage that change is underrated in and of itself. Being able to do
Yeah,
that. Well, Larry, look, we've
absolutely.
covered a lot of ground in this conversation. Obviously, I could spend kind of all afternoon diving in on probably one or two of just these points, but I think it's been great for you to be able to give that high level framing. It's amazing. Again, you said 110-year-old organization to be able to get that level of company that could have had a 50 or 70-year revenue plateau in the analog world to be able to move this quickly in this is should be inspiring to folks that feel like they should be moving faster, right? If it's possible there, it's got to be possible everywhere else. Really appreciate the conversation today, and I look forward to maybe following up a little bit later this year, seeing where you guys are at.
Thanks, Pat. Lovely to work with you.
All right, great. Take care.